Alrighty, good afternoon. Good to see everybody. Thank you for coming to today's event, University History Past, Present, and Future, a symposium in honor of Carroll Brentano. I am Gina Ann Garcia, Interim Associate Director at the Center for Studies in Higher Education. Established in 1957, the Center for Studies in Higher Education, or CSHE, is the first research institute in the United States devoted to the study of higher education. The center is associated with several scholars instrumental in shaping the University of California in the 20th and 21st century. Among them, Clark Kerr, Martin Troe, Neil Smesler, and others. In the course of the decade, it built a worldwide network of academics who came to Berkeley as visiting scholars, benefiting from the interactions at CSHE and the opportunities afforded by being at Berkeley. Books, articles, and even 2 journals grew out of this interaction and many highly diverse research projects. Today, the center is part of the Goldman School of Public Policy and continues the tradition of active collaborations with domestic and international scholars and research projects. The purpose of today's symposium is to honor Carroll Brentano through discussing her work on the university history. Carroll Brentano received her PhD from UC Berkeley in 1967 in art history and taught art history courses at UC Davis, San Jose State, Hayward State, and St. Mary's College. She researched campus planning as the coordinator of the University History Project at the CSHE here at Berkeley. Carroll Brentano firmly believed that the university and all those in it should know its own history. To that end, she was the moving force in creating the University History Project in 1989 and launching 2 periodicals documenting the history of the University of California. In particular, the issue called Ladies, Blue and Gold covers the history of women at Cal from many angles. From participation in sports, the YWCA, Cal Women in Music, students of color, famous alumni like Julia Morgan, student life, and much more. CSHE has been and still is the only consolidated center for work on the history of Berkeley and the UC. Now more than ever, as the significance of the history of Berkeley seems on the decline, her purpose is even more significant. This symposium commemorates her work and aspires to raise awareness of the importance of documenting the history of the university. The event is co-sponsored by the Center for Studies in Higher Education, the Department of History, the Berkeley School of Education, the History of Art Department, the American Studies Department, and the Department of Gender and Women's Studies. Now I'm going to give the floor over to Anne McLaughlin, Senior Researcher at CSHE, who is also the organizer of this symposium. She will lead a panel discussion on the legacy of Carroll Brentano and the history of the UC. Let's welcome her.
I won't do the usual academic thing and hog the microphone since we do have a panel. But first I want to thank you, Gina, for starting us off.
Speak into the mic, Ann.
Oh, that would be helpful. Yeah, that's much better. Okay. Welcome. But also, thank you for the opportunity to welcome you both to Berkeley campus and to CSHE. Gina is herself quite new to the campus and did very well with all the names.
Smeltzer.
Right, well, almost. And I think what's particularly interesting to us at CSHE and in relation to this symposium is her particular interest is in higher education and how Hispanic serving institutions enact an organizational identity for serving Latinx students and minoritized populations. Organizational identity being one of the reasons for knowing one's own university's history and a theme in today's discussion. So, randomly, that was a perfect match, so thank you. Before I turn to the program and introduce our speakers, I'd like to acknowledge those who made this event possible. First and foremost is George Blumenthal, the recent director of CSHE, who, and in a very informal conversation about wanting to give this symposium, which had been originally planned, I guess, 4 years ago with Paula Fess, he suggested that maybe I should just go for it, and the CSHE would support it. So I'm very grateful for that. I appreciate that Gina has already thanked the various co-sponsoring entities, but I would like to mention one who should have been among those, which is the Institute for Government Studies, because they had supported the activities of the center, and most particularly the publications that Carroll and Sheldon organized, supported in many ways. They paid for it, they handled the printing, and many of the other aspects of its appearance. So they should have been acknowledged initially. Also, I want to thank Shanshan Jiang, CSHE's new communications specialist, and our office manager, Helena Breitkars, who is unfortunately not here to be thanked in person. But amongst this group, there are a great many people who helped shape this. And you know who you are, so please accept my thanks. Gina touched on the primary goals of this, and I am not going to reiterate them. But I do want to use this occasion to make explicit the ways in which Carroll promoted university history, to be sure, but she built a community at Berkeley of scholars, not even like-minded scholars, I might add, because one of her characteristics was that she had an enormous tolerance for other points of view. That was very useful in framing these very diverse publications. The order of events here is I will speak a little more about Carroll's background, then I will introduce our really distinguished panelists and their relationship to Carroll and to this event. And also I want to make some definition about university history, what is past, what is present, and what I hope is the future of university history. Because without knowing your institution and its history and all of the people in it that have created the present, it's very hard to realize the extent and depth of the community that you're a member of. Okay, Carroll, I have a script I sweated over quite literally today. However, she was herself very big on impromptu remarks, and basically my formal script starts that Carroll Winslow Brentano was born on July 4th, 1926. That it was the 4th of July is a very important point. But alas died on May 9th in 2019 at the age of 92. In her obituary, the San Francisco Chronicle characterizes her life as one of optimism and adventure, and that most surely characterizes her in the context of the history of universities. It also needs to be pointed out that she was earning her PhD, or I should say working on her PhD, when she met her husband, Bob Brentano, in 1956, when I was in primary 4. It's also to be noted that 3 children later, and a wealth of activities, she finally finished that PhD in 1967. Okay, I'm monitoring my own time because, as I said, I don't want to hog the podium. I do want to say a little more, though. Her perspective on politics and the academy was extraordinarily positive, even when she denounced events she saw as ridiculous. and there are always quite a few. Her views never hindered her from truly listening to other points of view, and as I suggested, she would accept radically different ideas from her own without rancor, and never transferred her disagreement to judgment of the speaker or author in the case of one of the histories. And she was very encouraging to others. And I use the expression, go for it, because that was one of her favorite ones. And she was always encouraging people to do just that. Her interest in university history coalesced in the creation of the University History Project, which she very handily published an article about in the History of Universities, published in 1993, in which she describes plotting with Sheldon Rothblatt at lunch in spring of 1989 to create a seminar to study the history of the university, or at least of its Berkeley campus. 50 invitations were sent out, and I think 35 turned up. The participants were highly diverse in terms of discipline and status, which was another element of her complete openness to all stations within the university. So faculty, staff, students, non-university people were present. So the assembled wealth of knowledge led to the creation of the Chronicle of the University of California, which saw its first volume, #1, in 1993. It persevered for 9 issues until 2009. There are copies on the table there, and I hope when we break that you will have a look at them, because the scope of the articles and what they cover is truly phenomenal. Why the Center for Studies in Higher Education? Higher education is what we do. So it was a logical place for her to have her base, but also Sheldon was long affiliated with the center, as were a great number of people actually in this room. So that was why she came to draw on the center. But also, there were a couple of women there who were intensely supportive and were also very active in Carroll's projects. One of them was Janet Rule, who was the assistant manager. I'm never quite sure what her title had been, but basically she ran the place. She ran the Visiting Scholars program. She made sure every visitor was cared for. But like with Carroll, she also made sure everybody got the academic resources they needed and was a repository of knowledge, not just at the campus, but much more broadly in the field of education. And in Carroll's case, her knowledge far exceeded that of higher education. Okay, just a couple more remarks. I really would hope that there be another seminar for university history. This symposium is an effort to try and get that started. I may be an optimist rather. I'm not sure I'm as optimistic as Carroll could be, given the circumstance today for a discipline which seems to have largely fallen out of favor. However, I think it's important because of the need for a future history to be truly inclusive, to not take on the character of much of it in the past, including the standard works on the history of the University of California, in which women sort of flit across the pages and are not seen again. Women played a central role in the shaping of this institution, as did persons of color, and they are not represented in much of any of the literature, which is why we're particularly grateful to Gia, who, in relation to the 150 years celebrating women on campus, created the article that we are going to be listening to. Okay, so let me introduce our panel. Sheldon has such a large curriculum, there's no way I can present it except to summarize. He is a professor emeritus of history here and former director of CSHE. His career is distinguished with many publications in comparative university history, but he covers a great many areas, from the topic of his, I think it was your first book, The Revolution of the Dawns, Cambridge and Society in Victorian England, up through the present, where he has worked with many of the strategists and planners of the future. He also has received the Berkeley citation. Our next speaker is Karen Merritt. She is retired from the academic planning position at UC Office of the President and UC Merced. She was a member of Carroll Brentano's UC History Seminar during the 1990s and is co-editor of From Rangeland to Research University, The Birth of the University of California, Merced. She is much too modest in the bio that she gave me. She is an indefatigable historian of major figures within this university, and she was active at UC Merced as an associate vice chancellor, setting it up. Catherine Neal is our third speaker. She has worked at UC Berkeley since 2005 as the university archivist. She builds, manages, and helps to provide access to official inactive records and other significant materials that document the history of the Berkeley campus and the Office of the President. She served on the editorial board of the Chronicle of the University of California under Carroll Brentano's leadership and from 2007 until it ceased publication. Kathy also worked with Carroll and her family members on the donation to the Bancroft Library of the papers of her husband, the late Professor Robert Brentano, as well as with staff from the Center of Studies of Higher Education to transfer Carroll's own papers. Our last member of the panel is John Aubrey Douglas, Senior Research Fellow at CSHE. His most recent book is on neo-nationalism and universities, for which he's the editor, dealing with populists, autocrats, and the future of higher education. He's published extensively on university history and contemporary affairs. The most recent publication, Creating a Great Public University, The History and Influence of Shared Governance at the University of California, just out in our Research Educational Papers series. He also created the University of California Digital Archive. With that, I am going to turn it over to our first speaker. I will introduce Gia separately once we have conducted our panel discussion. So we need a microphone at the table. You have one? Okay, that's good.
Thanks, Anne. That was wonderful. It reminded me of things I'd forgotten. Time goes by. It's awfully nice to see people I haven't seen for a very long time. And to remember heady days for the past. Anne and I, I'll walk back. But you need to have, scholars need to have a quotation from some distinguished authority in order to start speaking. So racking my brains, I've come up with Yogi Berra, who some of you know, most of you know. Maybe they don't all know that he was once a catcher for the New York Yankees and famous for his butchering of the English language. At any rate, he introduced himself on one occasion by saying, "I'd like to thank everyone here who made this occasion necessary." So, we made this occasion necessary, and it's great. I knew Carroll, since 1956. All right, think back. I was an undergraduate, and I was reading Victorian novels with her husband-to-be, and that was Bob Brentano. One day I showed up in his office for a tutorial, and she was sitting there, and she identified me by name, which surprised me, but she did. Then the years passed. I returned to Berkeley as a faculty member, and Bob Brentano was my colleague, and I saw Carroll often. She was, as you might have gathered from Anne's presentation, Anne didn't quite say it, but she hinted, Carroll was a bit of a character. And the early character, the early Carroll was quite a character. But you know something, I decided not to tell you anything about that because you probably want to know these details, and I think they'll be hidden from you, and I won't say anything about it. But let me go back to the subject that Anne wants to talk about and has talked about so wisely, and that is the importance of the doing of university history, and particularly with respect to the University of California. When I became director, I was looking for a project. I am an historian, and I was struck by the fact that of all the places I had been and taught, less was said amongst the Berkeley faculty about the history of their campus and what went on here and what was unique and special about it. That there seemed to be a kind of vacuum. That vacuum has been filled in. Karen has filled it in. John has done wonderful work. So there's been much that has gone on, I think, since I left the center that's really terrific. But at that time, there was this appalling ignorance. And I remember that when I entered Cambridge University, it was necessary for all the students to show up in hall where the provost of, it was King's College, Cambridge, the provost of the college would lecture on the history of the college in relation to the university, and would go through the portraits, all the provosts had their portraits on the walls. We'd go back centuries, of course, King was founded in the 15th century. And he would tell the history of the institution through those portraits. The point being that it was really important for anyone entering the college to know where they were, what they belonged to, and what traditions they were to maintain and keep going. And that was as important and more important for Cambridge University than football is for the University of California. But it was the same idea. How do you attach your body of faculty, teachers and students to an institution in the hope, and indeed I think it can be proven, that that attachment will make it a richer and better and stronger place and more emotionally appealing to its graduates. So I don't know, discussions ensued about how to do this. And I remember, I can't quite remember what Anne has reminded me of, but I remember that I thought to myself, Carroll was looking for something really to do. And Carroll had this, again Anne has mentioned this, extraordinary attachment to Berkeley. She was really an old blue. And I thought to myself, if there anybody I wanted to work with, it was Carroll, not only because I've known her forever, but because of her devotion to the campus, her love for the campus, and the way in which she threw herself into expressing that love. So if I needed a partner, it had to be Carroll. And also somebody who wasn't so taken up with other activities, because, you know, as directors know, you're only half-time or something of the sort, you've got a whole other life to lead. I had really envisaged a series of volumes on the history. I thought to myself, look at Harvard, look at Princeton, look at Yale, look at Oxford, look at Cambridge. They keep producing books about various aspects of their history, and we don't, except for the fact that we must give credit to Clark Kerr, because of the fact that he knew that history was important, and he commissioned the first and really the only, I think, major history of the university that we have. I think outdated, but very good as far as yeah. Vern Stadtland, yeah. Really the indispensable way to start. And I approached the University of California Press, and there was no interest whatsoever. And I thought to myself, once again, looking at the other universities where the university presses seem to eagerly accept and want and commission volumes about themselves, here there was no interest. And I sort of said, well, let me put out a proposal and send it out, et cetera, et cetera. But the editor really didn't want it, and all right, I don't know where he is these days, but the project was killed. Okay, so there was to be no multi-history of the University of California. It would have taken decades to produce that anyhow, but there was to be none from that source, from the campus's own university press. And I thought that was scandalous, okay? You could have argued on other grounds, maybe the people weren't available, maybe we weren't going to get the kind of history you wanted, etc. But that wasn't what the argument that was made. So could we do something else? And then we had the cooperation, full cooperation, of a campus-based press, and that was in the Institute for Governmental Studies. Jerry Lubin, now gone, was wonderful about it all. And so we worked out an arrangement and commissioned us, what, chapters, I think, we call them chapters in the history of the University of California. And we did any number of them. They were supposed to be sort of dipping into the vast ocean of the university's history to try to get things going off the ground, and the hope that then other such chapters would come along in due course. But by then I was leaving, I was retiring, and I was going off to teach abroad. So that left the project, my part of the project, in the hands of others. And Carroll had also conceived of this university chronicle. And she got to work on that and produced the issues that you can see on the back table. She really continued this in the spirit. And then John was coming in. John, you were arriving, you were adding immeasurably to all of this, strengthening it, I think broadening it, getting it out there in marvelous ways, which you continue to do. And Karen came in, and she's founding campuses and things like that. So we got a taste, and a good taste of what we wanted to do. And I think when you look at the corpus today, it might be better than what I could have expected, but with a lot more, as Anne has said, that we really have to do. Now, one final note on all of this. The one thing I thought I could do, well, I thought we could offer seminars, actually classes for credit in the history of the university, through the center, but through the cooperation with the history department and other departments. But that didn't materialize. I don't think I made the strongest effort at that time because I was really leaving. But the one thing I could do in subsequent years is in teaching freshman and sophomore courses on the campus is try to instill in the undergraduates some sense of the territory that they were occupying. And for some years, and sometimes with the help of a friend, architect and city planner here at Berkeley, we walked classes of students around the campus to let them know that the physical environment in which they live had a particular kind of significance, and that if they were to walk across the campus, it shouldn't always be with their heads down, that they should sometimes look at what's around them. How many of them realize that Abraham Lincoln's face is on the Campanile? How many here realize that Abraham Lincoln's face is on the Campanile? What's it doing there? Or that the Berkeley campus is two campuses, and two campuses at war with one another historically. The first campus, part of the campus, we're sitting on, and that is the original conception of the campus partly as a liberal arts college. And if you walk through Faculty Glade and around here, you will notice that this is exactly English landscape design of the 18th century, meant when transferred to universities for undergraduates. Okay? It's an undergraduate campus. Women's Faculty Club sits on an undergraduate campus. I could go into detail on why it's that way, but it is that way. Then came the urban campus, French. And from that Campanile onwards, you see the Beaux-Arts traditions, and the rest are more professional, more city-oriented. And there's been a war throughout Berkeley's history, a kind of wonderful cultural war between these two conceptions of the university and the resources then that should go to each. And so we tried, in a variety of ways, to get the message out that where you attended your university was important, and that the university was filled with iconographic symbols, filled with all kinds of buildings that were not accidental, like we got to think that maybe some of the later ones were accidental, but filled with all kinds of symbols of what the history of the institution really was and meant, and that they should, as students of the place, pay some attention to that. So that is the story of my life.
Yes, thank you.
Can you all hear me okay? I've got notes to try to keep you on track here. My focus is on how Carroll Brentano's UC History seminar during the 1990s had an effect on 10th campus planning for the University of California. The context was the Regent's Site Selection Task Force working in the late 80s and 90s, supported by staff. And two of us on that staff attended the seminar. Chris Adams, who was university architect and a physical planner, and me representing academic affairs. Our particular interest that brought us to the seminar: how were the new UC campuses of the 1860s, I can do that one too, the 1960s built and planned? This question was of interest to others. John Douglas at the time was writing briefing papers for the Academic Senate, which also wanted to know what was the Senate's role when 3 new campuses were created for UC in the 1960s. The seminar had important assets for us, besides a congenial group of people who were interested in the subject and brought their own points of view and backgrounds to them. Sam McCullough, the UC Irvine historian, who was the author of the founding of the book about the founding of UC Irvine, which he entitled Instant University, was one of the regular people to attend. Marion Gade, who was a longtime research associate of Clark Kerr, was another one, and of particular note was she was working with Clark Kerr at this time on his presidential memoir, The Gold and the Blue. Clark Kerr himself shared some of his work, particularly his draft chapter on UC Santa Cruz, that several of us had the privilege of reading and reacting to. We also had access to his ideas about the 10th campus. In the 1960s, he had hoped to build a 10th campus in the San Joaquin Valley, and state funding wasn't there for that. Chris and I discovered, as we were looking through archival material, that there was actually a confidential assessment of a site that could have been a 10th campus site that Chris and I ourselves had inspected on behalf of the task force. One of the great things about archival research is you never know what you're going to find. Kerr had pinpointed some special needs of the San Joaquin Valley, notably the shortage of physicians and the need for research on health issues, for example, valley fever, a unique malady in the valley, and the very high incidence of asthma. He couldn't build a campus, but what he did do was bring UC San Francisco to Fresno with a center that both did research and also had placements for newly minted MPs as residents in Valley hospitals. So in his own way, he was able to use the resources of the system to make a presence that's been very important to the Valley. He continued to believe in the 1990s that the 10th campus should have a strong health sciences presence. And I would note that UC Merced has established a public health program, and just this year, freshman into an undergraduate program that will eventually bring them to an MD at UC San Francisco. Very much a model that Riverside successfully used with UCLA, and now they have their medical school. During our years in the Carroll seminar, Chris looked at master planning for UC Santa Cruz and UC Irvine, and I did some work on a campus that I knew well from my days in the University of Wisconsin System Office, UW Green Bay. I was particularly interested in experimental campuses in the 60s. Of course, Santa Cruz was one of them. And I looked at how hiring for the chancellor was done for UW Green Bay, which had this intention to be a very new kind of curriculum. Edward Widener, who was at the University of Kentucky in the Center for Development Change, whatever that meant, was recruited, and he was recruited in a way men were recruited in the 60s. There were a couple of letters, do you know a good man who would start this Green Bay campus? And again, a little archival discovery was one of the good men was Jack Eldison. However, because according to the writer of the letter, he was really dedicated to going to UC Irvine. Take a look at Ed Widener. That's how searches were done in the 1960s. I won't go into details about the issues around this experimental campus. It had a curriculum with new kinds of majors with new kinds of titles that were unfamiliar. There were enrollment problems because of that. We wanted a history major, but we couldn't quite tell if they could taught history. And what's happened historically is, in the sense of like Santa Cruz, a kind of regression to the mean. So it doesn't look very different these days from curricula at established campuses. Carroll wanted me to take a look at Evergreen State, which is Washington's experimental campus. But at that very time, the Cal State system was repurposing a military site near Monterey into a new campus, and darned if they didn't have majors you never heard of before under names you'd never heard of before. Though I think the water problem is the toughest one for them. Chris and I were able to do presentations of our work, which was a very important thing for us. The seminar hosted a number of presentations we both did. And we were able to take what we were doing to our professional association, the Society for College and University Planning. Chris published in Planning for Higher Education what makes a good master plan, focused on UC Irvine and UC Santa Cruz. And I did a presentation for SCUP under the title What an Experimental College of the 1960s Can Tell Us About Effective Academic Planning for New Campuses. We were both very grateful for what we were able to take away from Carroll's seminar into our places of work.
So thank you, Anne, for inviting me to participate in this event to honor Carroll. and to share brief reminiscences of my experiences with her. So of the panelists, I knew Carroll the least amount of time, but even our history dates back to 2006, or actually 2007, some 16 years ago. I was still relatively new to my position, having come to Berkeley in 2005. And in early 2007, then Bancroft Library Director Charles Fallhaber and then University Archivist David Farrell rightly thought that it would be helpful for me to connect me with Carroll, who was managing editor of the history journal, the Chronicle of the University of California, and her editorial associate Janet Rule. So after a Get Acquainted lunch in March 2007, David approached Carroll about the prospect of my joining the editorial board to offer current liaison to the Bancroft Library and University Archives to complement Bill Roberts, who I just spotted in the audience there, retired university archivist who already was on the board. A quarterly publication called the University Chronicle, later known as the University of California Chronicle, had run from 1898 to 1933, featuring public addresses, other important campus-related documents, and as described by the modern All right, can you still hear me? Yes. Okay. So public addresses, other important campus-related documents, and as described by the modern editorial board, in its A Word to the Reader section of the first issue, quote, intelligent and entertaining accounts of contemporary events in the university's academic and administrative life. Well, I was already impressed by the new Chronicle, which Carroll had played a key role in reviving. The first issue appearing in 1998, 100 years after the older publication. The journal was well designed, its articles well researched and nicely illustrated, and contained ample use of archival sources. I also appreciated the thematic approach, which, to quote from the Center for Studies in Higher Education's homepage for the Chronicle, were single themes that presented an inherent longitudinal view of the university's development. I figured I couldn't say it any better than that. The range of those themes was considerable, even in 8 issues to that point, covering the subjects of disasters on campus, the already mentioned history of women on campus, which was especially useful as the university celebrated the 150th anniversary of the admission of women students, the university's environment and beyond, and agriculture and gastronomy, to name only a few. Carroll and the other board members accepted my appointment, and I would join her, Janet, Steve Finicum, Ann Lage, who also is in the audience, Lynn Nakata, Roberta Park, Nat Permal, and again, Bill Roberts, as a 9th member, initially in twice monthly meetings, when possible, in an Evans Hall conference room. And in her welcoming message, Carroll said, quote, we bring lunches, eat whatever sweets have been brought from the board's travels, and go over the items of the day. Very informal. Well, I found that to be true. There was an informality that fostered a sense of community, but there was also a serious dedication to the task at hand, producing a high-quality publication. We discussed future themes, prospective authors, article status, marketing ideas, web presence, and other editorial concerns. And early on in my term, we were also contributing Cal trivia-based questions and answers to California Magazine for the Bona Fides section that was featured at that time. Our meeting venue would change to Great Hall in the faculty club, but this focus stayed the same. Ever the promoter of the journal to the campus and broader UC communities, Carroll always kept an eye out for opportunities to distribute, the publication and called on us to help with that effort. As only one example, she regularly reserved a booth at Cal Day so that we could sell issues and try to engage new readers. She seemed to be a tireless advocate, volunteering much of her time and energy. I participated on the board through one published issue only, issue 9, though we had the makings of number 10. The theme of that issue was Rise and Demise, which featured articles addressing creation and growth, change and renewal at the university. The passing of Janet Rule in 2011 dealt a blow to our board. Janet, whom I viewed as a quiet force, was a strong partner to Carroll, having been a member of SCHE's research staff and then its assistant director for 17 years, not to mention an editor of the California Pelican, the student humor magazine, back in the 50s when she was a student. Carroll had once described us as a volunteer and very part-time group, and that too led to a gentle fade out of the journal. The 9 issues of the Chronicle are a permanent historical resource, however. Print copies are available in libraries throughout the system, and the center has digitized them and made them accessible online. The 9 issues of the Chronicle also are part of Carroll's legacy, but we've preserved her life and experiences in additional ways. In 2016, my archival colleague Lauren Lasleben and I received access to Carroll's office in Evans Hall and from some CSHE staff members to sort through and select from her materials. We now have an 8.3 linear feet box of material, which translates to 6 cartons and 2 boxes of materials that reflect her work in the center and are available for research. They date from approximately 1956, so as we now know, shortly around the time of her arrival here. Some of her earliest years on campus, to 1999, and includes some of her Chronicle files, some of the center's annual reports and studies, and a photo album of publicity events for the Chronicle. A copy of Carroll's article about the town and gown relationship, the 2 Berkeleys, city and university through 125 years, is in the archives, while the UC Berkeley main library houses her doctoral dissertation, which, as we also know, she produced on this campus in 1967. And I'll also note that we have the CSHE's records dating from 1956 to 2007 that, before full processing, fill 105 cartons. Thanks to Janet Rule, who prepared them and arranged them and arranged for their transfer from the Marchand building in 2009. Well, as many of you know, Carroll's husband, Robert Brentano, a scholar of medieval Italian church history, had a career in the UC Berkeley History Department dating back to 1952. In later years, he chaired the Academic Senate, among other accomplishments. Carroll had wondered if we might be interested in accepting his papers. Starting around 2013, she had enlisted the help of her granddaughter-in-law, Jenna Brentano, to sort through the materials, which had a bit of a haphazard arrangement, which I think was actually her word. Jenna consulted with me via email initially, and then Carroll welcomed my archivist colleagues, again, Lauren Lasleben, Michelle Morgan, and me to her home to begin to assess them. And I commend Jenna on the work that she did, especially as a part-time project, and for being such a delightful contact. The papers came to the library in 2021 after Carroll's death, but I thank her daughter, Margaret Brentano, and daughter-in-law, Dama Brentano, whom we worked with virtually on the final preparation of the gift, for their kind assistance as well. Although not yet arranged and described, Professor Brentano's collection includes correspondence, course materials, UC Berkeley administrative records, research materials, his writings, and photographs. Scores of researchers, students, faculty, staff, alumni, the general public, and scholars from all over the world use the archives. The materials that we collect provide the raw data that researchers draw from to develop their class papers, case studies, reports, genealogical projects, and the like. I would like to think that Carroll would be cheering every time it happens, while also underscoring that it not be taken for granted. So I'll end by extending thanks to Carroll for her scholarship, for her wit, and for her tremendous dedication to the study of UC and UC Berkeley history.
You can clap. Well, I'm going to say that I see a lot of good friendly faces here. People I haven't seen in a long time, so we're talking about that. And some people that knew Carroll very well, and with her in the Chronicle and other things I see here, she noted already. Is Steve going to come here? Okay, Steve was going to come, but I know Bill. I know Bill Roberts and Ann Lage, who worked so hard on those Chronicle publications. So I also want to just do a shout out to Carol Lenshaw, who invited me up when I was a graduate student at UC Santa Barbara to give a talk at the center. It was on the fourth branch of government, which was UC, according to my paper. And I'll only also note that that was part of a larger piece that became my book, The California ID in American Higher Education. It's about all of California higher ed, public higher ed. It wasn't just about UC. But I had it accepted by UC Press, but then they suddenly told me it was not, they weren't going to take it because they didn't publish in UC history. And so I got this published by Stanford. So it's an interesting thing. So you know, Carol was a character. I'm not going to say too much more, but she was always really interesting to listen to and talk with when she came to center meetings and we would collaborate on various things. I just want to make a couple of comments about UC history in general that align a little bit with what Sheldon was saying, is that, you know, the UC history is not just Berkeley, it's the development of a 10-campus system that is really the premier higher education university network in the world. And by any measures you want to use, I'm not a big fan of ranking, but you can see all kinds of matrices that show just what the incredible reach the university has, not just in its research output, but also in its public service and teaching and learning and mentoring programs over time and currently. And another thing that makes UC interesting in terms of its history is one, that all the campuses have the same mission, which is very different than, you know, SUNY or Michigan, the University of Michigan system, or Penn State or others, is that we have data that goes way back and is reasonably coherent. And this is one of the projects that's now at the center of the Cliometric History Project, which I've had a hand in helping, but Zach Bleemer is really the leader in that. And they're looking at records of students that go back to the turn of the last century, and they can do all kinds of interesting analysis as to where students came from, what their backgrounds were. So there's, you know, a tremendous opportunity that we're just beginning to look at, I think, more carefully about longitudinal data that is unique. There's just nothing like it in the UC system. And so another thing I just want to point to is that I think Sheldon and some of you here in this audience and others also kind of took up doing university history and the history of the Berkeley campus at a very important time, because there was a whole cohort of people that had memories about the development of UC in Berkeley in the late 50s, the post-World War II period, going into the 60s, and everything from the loyalty oath to, you know, the free speech movement and civil rights and other kinds of things that kind of linked back. And the other part, though, that why we're still kind of in good shape, I think, was getting back to the last moment, I think, that was really significant, which Sheldon noted too, was Parker's support for Vern Stedman's history, but also the Centennial Record, if you're aware of that, which is online, which digitized through a project I helped lead at one point with Sally Brown. And that also included departmental histories for every campus. Now they're short, they're biased, they have problems, but that's an incredible record, and I kind of hope we could get back to that at some point. It'd be nice to get, we're actually kind of too late, I think, actually, in some of the cohort to really give a coherency as to how these departments develop, or other kinds of subparts of the larger story that makes Berkeley or UC interesting in various ways. And then finally, which has kind of been one thing I've been trying to do over time, is, you know, to use history. Yes, it's interesting into itself, it's informative to our contemporary world, but also is kind of a way of looking at policy innovation. And we were talking about that before, by looking in the past, well, how did we create new campuses? What structures or things can we learn in order to be more informed in our efforts in the future? So it is a source of innovation, I think, and you know, the important part is also that it has to be history that looks at the good, the bad, and the ugly. It has to be everything. And so I think there's still more work to be done on that, but I think it's important. And finally, I just want to say how important the archives are and archivists. And I was on a committee that I co-chaired with Pat Pelfrey a while back, which we talked about a little bit, or emailed each other, that tried to support the concept that we needed to have a more robust financial picture and support. But Bill Roberts was there and working with Charles Faldhaber trying to get the Office of the President to put in more money. But we really need a much more larger support structure for the archival side of the story. And I think it's just kind of a shame. In the report, we looked at other investments by Indiana University and other places. And basically what I would say is that UC looked really like it was falling short. Now there are complications because it is a multi-campus system. It's very different in other ways. But I get back to how important it is that we invest in various ways, not just in records management, but in good archival work and support that so we can have historians and others use those resources to go to the good and the bad and the ugly. So with that, thank you very much. Oh, I want to say thank you to Anne for all your efforts to put this together. So, and I'm looking forward to Gina's presentation as well. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank all four of you. And
There we go.
well, thank you all. Very interesting and very different presentations, very much so contributing to the main idea of Carroll and university history. There is a slight pessimistic thread, I fear, in terms of potentially creating a dynamic center for university history in the future, but let us not be discouraged. In any case, I'm wondering, because several people are here who were part of the original group, if you have something you might like to say or contribute or comment on from the panel. Steve?
I'll try to be very brief. I'm Steve Finneck. He's on the editorial board of Chronicle with Carroll. And a couple anecdotes about Carroll. She went, every year she involved went to Venice, spent part of the summer in Venice, and she would come back and she would bring us all, she had a little handful of Murano glass. She'd put it out on the table in her first week of the fall, and we would pick the things we wanted. I have some little cherries, some little glass cherries. But Carroll was very, very Catholic in her historical taste. She would talk about anything. I only remember one occasion when she wouldn't talk about something, and that's when I wanted to interview her about her experience watching the notorious Great UC Candy Raid in 1956. I think she would not talk about that. I'm still not sure why, but she was a student and a spectator for that. Let's see. And she also had a great sense of humor and could just cut to the center of things. We went once to talk to the Cal History and Traditions decal. I don't know if that still exists. And she and I gave a presentation on the architecture and buildings of the campus. And so she asked the group a question. Do you know such and such? Do you know why such and such a building is this way? Total silence in the room. And Carol looked at them and she said, well, you don't know very much, do you? And I was sort of aghast. I was like, Carol, you can't speak to undergraduates like but it was true. To fill in a little bit of context on the UC Chronicles, so in the days before it was created, we talked, Carol's ambition was to have a UC history museum. We talked about how that could come about, it wasn't possible to create anything. And at one meeting I finally said, well, if we can't do a museum, why don't we do a newsletter, like a little historical journal? And I had in mind something like an 8-page mimeographed fold-over thing. And Carol took the idea and in a wonderful way, a competent way of organizing things with Janet, and all she turned it into an incredible journal. But I wanted to plant with the group, in particular in terms of talking about the future. The history museum was what her ultimate goal was for the campus. And today that could be a virtual museum, it could be all sorts of things, but that was really a central ambition there.
Any other comments? No? Okay. Well, then let us move on, and we shall have an opportunity at the end for wrapping up and for commentary. But I'm very pleased to introduce Gia, who also had a very modest bio in terms of what she provided me, which I'm going to kind of largely ignore. What she is at the moment is the administrative director for both Global International American Studies and the Institute of European Studies. She graduated from UC Berkeley, as one can gather from her article, in 1986 with a degree in Spanish language and literature, and is a longtime staff member. She currently serves as a steering committee member for the Black Lives at Cal project. And what she has left out of her own description is that she has become a very sophisticated social historian of the Black East Bay community, which she shares with many of us on occasion with tours of the Oakwood Cemetery, which is just down the street from where I am. So, Gia, thank you so much. And do you want to be up here?
Yes, I'll be up here.
Okay, then
I have to own this up in a second.
There you go.
Okay, everybody can see it, right? Well, that title, thank you. That title is a bit of a tip of the hat to Carroll Brentano, who sadly I never got to know, but I feel like she's a kindred spirit. So hello everyone, it's truly an honor to be before you today to talk about the lives of the first African American women to attend the University of California after the admission of women in 1870. Also, to speak right here in the Women's Faculty Club, a space that fully embraces the history and the mission of inclusion here through these doors since the founding in 1919. Additionally, Lucy Ward Stebbins, the first president of the Women's Faculty Club, and the Dean of Women from 1917 to 1923, was one of the few allies of the first cohort of African American women during their time on the Berkeley campus. I would like to thank Dr. Ann McLaughlin for inviting me to give this talk and for truly appreciating the work I did and continue to do to ensure that their stories are remembered and retold. I also want to thank Dr. Sheila Humphrey. She's not here today, but I met her back in 1989 when I was a recent Berkeley grad looking for experience in the burgeoning world of computers at the time. This led me to my first job on campus in electrical engineering and computer science, EECS. Mind you, I thought I would stay 1 year, and now I will soon embark on my 34th year as a staff member on campus. Sheila took a genuine interest in me as a department receptionist, and in her post as the first EECS Director of Diversity, she was an incredible ally herself. Over the years, she has expended tireless effort to chronicle the history of Black students in STEM and to support various campus initiatives relating to Black history on this campus. Who would have thought our paths would cross again so many years later, and that she would ask me to contribute to the 150th Anniversary of Women project by writing a piece that reflected my own personal research of the lives of these women. It felt like fate. Everything from that point on lined up in such a way that I was able to have both the time and opportunity to advance my research. 100 years. It took 100 years to see the collective faces of the first African American women to attend the University of California, acknowledged on a scale that they could never have even imagined. Their faces projected on UC Berkeley's website banner in March of 2021. This was a decision by a journalist named Anne Bryce from the Berkeley. She had interviewed me and wrote an article to amplify their life stories. I was absolutely floored and overjoyed. Their historic presence was finally visible and on the Berkeley website. Let us rewind the clock to the 1920-21 academic year. At that time, there were 17 Black students on campus. How do we know this? We know this because of none other than Ida Louise Jackson, whose oral history titled Overcoming Barriers in Education was conducted in 1984 and 1985 by Gabrielle Morris. Morris was an interviewer and editor for the Regional Oral History Office at the Bancroft Library. Her work yielded invaluable insights on those early days of the Black student college experience. Ida Louise Jackson spearheaded the organization of the Rho chapter of the Alpha Kappa Alphas, the AKAs, and another powerhouse named Vivian Osborne formed the Delta Sigma Theta sorority. So now there were 2 sororities on campus made up of Black women, both of them West Coast first. Ida Louise tells the story of how the AKAs scraped up the money to take this beautiful photo in 1921. They were excited that it would be displayed in the blue and gold yearbook, and their presence would finally be acknowledged. I say finally because Ida Louise talks about how her classmates rendered her invisible in their eyes and would never engage with her. So their photo being part of the campus record was highly anticipated. However, when eagerly flipping through the pages of the annual copy of the blue and gold, they found no trace of their photo. As Ida Louise stated in her oral history, we were not in there, and it was just a terrible thing. Ida Louise was not going to take that sitting down. She made an appointment for the members of the AKAs to meet President David Prescott Barrows to ask him directly why. Why was their photo not in the yearbook? He told them they were not representative of the student body. This intentional act of erasure was devastating, but it did not damage their resolve or distract them from their goals. So now, fast forward to March 4th, 2021, when I clicked on the homepage of the Berkeley website and saw their beaming faces on the Berkeley banner. 100 years later, it was indeed poetic justice. Delayed, mind you, for quite some time, but still so gratifying. I only wished that they could see. The majority of the first African American women to attend UC Berkeley had their roots in the South. Their families moved from Louisiana, Texas, Alabama, Mississippi, Missouri, Florida, and Virginia during the first wave of the Great Migration. California was the hope of Black families for better opportunities for their children, and also a way to exit the threat of violence that loomed large for African Americans, especially in the South. Now, I'm just going to talk a little bit about each of their stories, starting with Vivian Logan Rogers. Vivian Logan Rogers was the first African American woman to graduate from UC Berkeley in 1909. Her father came to California during the gold rush era as an enslaved person, and he found a way to never go back to the South. He became rather well off because he had skills as a mining engineer. And he had 5 daughters. Vivian was the youngest, and she got a teaching job in Hilo, Hawaii in 1913. Some months later, though, she fell ill with typhoid fever, and on May 13, 1914, the Honolulu Star Bulletin lists her as a passenger leaving on the SS Lurline. And you can see her name is there at the bottom. And she's very ill at this point. She's trying to get home. But sadly, she does make it home. She recovers a little bit, but she dies just 3 months later at the very young age of 29. Her family was very well known in Stockton, California, and there's even a house that's a national register on the National Registry for the Moses Rogers family. Okay, we talked about Ida Louise Jackson, but I'm going to expound on her a little bit. Of course, I've already mentioned she was the founder of the Road Chapter of the AKAs on the West Coast. She was also the first African-American teacher in Oakland Public Schools and founded the Mississippi Health Project, which brought much-needed medical attention to children and adults in rural Mississippi via mobile clinics. This project was so successful and groundbreaking at the time that she was invited to the White House to meet Eleanor Roosevelt. She also donated her Mendocino ranch to UC Berkeley, specifying that the proceeds should go to support graduate fellowships for Black students. She did not have children, and so there was a board that managed her estate. In 1971, she received the Berkeley Citation. Now this is Berlinda Davison, and when I found her, and I did a lot of research looking up her name, it was just thrilling because there were lots of misspellings. Some said Davidson, Belinda, there was all kinds of versions of her name, but I finally got to find her, and what I found was amazing. She was the first African-American woman to earn her master's degree from UC Berkeley, and interestingly enough, her brother Stuart was the first African-American to graduate from the UC Medical School in 1918. At first, it was just so difficult to find information, but I was really thrilled when I found this photo of her on the cover of The Crisis, a publication created in 1910 by W.E.B. Du Bois to record and highlight all issues of importance, along with art and culture, to African Americans nationwide. And he always had an annual college edition where he personally would reach out to the higher education universities, and he reached out to the UC Berkeley campus as well to get information on their students, right? And this is what I found, Berlinda on the cover of the magazine. And he always wanted to celebrate their success in education. And I think it was great. It was all over the nation that he did this. So let's see, we'll go forward with Vivian Osborne. Now, I've already mentioned her as she's the second African-American woman to receive her master's degree in anthropology. She formed the Deltas at Berkeley and was always heavily involved in the community. She was director of the Oakland Junior Branch of the NAACP from 1928 to 1929, and then she traveled to Washington, D.C. to represent her sorority in their campaign for anti-lynching legislation. There's also a Berkeley Scholarship named after her to support Black students in pursuit of their education. I think that's a fairly new development. Now here's the story of Modest Aurea Thiel Richardson. And I tell her story, it's another person who died very, very young. But just to the range of people here, not everybody has a Wikipedia page or you could find lots of information about them. I was so thrilled to find Modest. She migrated from Louisiana with her family and settled in Berkeley. And she attended Berkeley High School. This is her yearbook photo on the left. And it stated that she was a member of the piano club. She entered UC Berkeley in 1921 and is one of the original members of the AKAs headed by Ida Louise Jackson. She graduated with a BA in French and music, but sadly she died at the age of 26 from tuberculosis, which is really kind of ironic. She got here in 1917 with her family. She survived the influenza pandemic, and then tuberculosis is the thing that took her out. But I always want to talk about her story. Okay, this is Annie Virginia Stevens, and she was the first African-American woman to earn her law degree from Berkeley Law School. She was one of 2 women in a class of 47 students. She passed the bar exam, but really couldn't find work in California. She returned to Virginia and had a private practice there for about 10 years. She then returned to California in 1939 and joined the State Office of Legislative Counsel. She's talked about frequently now at the law school and in the Berkeley, and there's been several articles on her. But what's really great about her and her husband, George Coker, is that they would also tutor students, Black students, on the bar so that they could successfully pass the bar exam. So I think as a couple they were a powerhouse, but in her own right, she's an amazing woman. Okay. This is Louise Alone Thompson. She teamed up with Vivian Osborne and the Deltas, and she was a member of the Spanish Honor Society and was inspired by a speech given by W.E.B. Du Bois when he visited campus 100 years ago, this year. So his speech was in 1923 at Wheeler Hall, and she was there. She graduated cum laude with a degree in economics and taught for a while at the Hampton Institute in Virginia. She became great friends with Langston Hughes and worked in close quarters with other members of the Harlem Renaissance. She also helped organize Angela Davis's Defense Fund. Her daughter came to campus in 2020, just before everything shut down, and gave a talk about her mother's life experiences. She had a long lifespan, and she was always active in social justice causes. Now this is Ruby Jefferson. She was also part of the original AKAs. Both she and Ida Louise Jackson were from Mississippi, and Ida Louise encouraged her family to bring Ruby out here to California. And Ruby's picture never appeared in the Blue and Gold. Some of them just were so discouraged by that initial situation that they didn't seek that out anymore. So this is sort of like a cutout of her AKA photo. But she graduated with a BA in education in 1924. And it was really difficult to find out a lot about her, but I stumbled upon an oral history of her brother, Bernard Jefferson. And he was a well-respected judge and one of the first African-American appointees in the California judiciary. He described their early life in Mississippi and the fact that their parents cared most about education. They wanted their kids to have the ability to get a good education and not in a state like Mississippi, which was so oppressive. So they brought the family out here, and then he described Ruby, to my delight, as a retired elementary school teacher who had worked for many years in the Los Angeles school district. Okay, this is Terea Hall Pittman. Anyone know about the South Branch of the Berkeley Library? Named after her. Terea Hall Pittman enrolled in UC Berkeley in 1923, but then she dropped out of school to support her husband, William Pittman, who graduated from the San Francisco Dental School. Now that's a familiar scenario for a lot of women in those days. But Terea went back to school and received her BA degree from San Francisco State in 1942, and then returned to Berkeley and graduated with a master's in social welfare in 1946. She became a well-known leader in the African-American community in the Bay Area, and of course, like I said, the South Branch. I used to go by there all the time and go, who is Terea Hall? Yeah, it happened in 2015 that they actually named it in her honor, and now it's sort of, the light bulb went off after I did my research on her. Amazing person. Now this is Thelma Brooks. She was also one of the original AKAs. Her picture didn't appear in the blue and gold, but that's because she actually never graduated. She went to Oakland High and graduated from there in 1920, and then she entered UC Berkeley in 1921, but she just never managed to finish her degree. However, she stayed very active in the city of Oakland and worked alongside Terea Hall Pittman in the California Federation of Women's Clubs. So I like this picture that I found of her in a diverse group of singers called the Jackson Chorale Society in 1935 in Oakland. So it's just, she's just stayed in the community, and I would notice sometimes in the column of Delilah Beasley, who also chronicled very well the activities of Black people in California. She would be singing here and there. Her name would come up in the community, singing or working with Terea Hall Pittman. So she didn't have a huge career, but she stayed in the community and was really an integral part. This is Miriam Matthews. Her family moved from Pensacola, Florida to Southern California when she was 2 years old. She graduated from high school in 1922 and spent 2 years at the University of California Southern Branch, which it was called at that time, and then transferred to Berkeley. She earned her bachelor's in Spanish, then earned her certificate in library science in 1927, becoming the first credentialed African-American librarian in the state. She was the chairperson of the Committee on Intellectual Freedom during the McCarthy era. And a 1947 article in the California Eagle, which was a Black-owned newspaper at the time, talked about how she, quote, vigorously upheld the right for intellectual freedom and emphasized the urgent need for intercultural understanding. She successfully prevented the establishment of a board of censors in the Los Angeles County Public Library. Sadly, we need those kinds of efforts again today with all that is going on in this country. In 2004, the Hyde Park Branch Library was rebuilt and named in her honor. And finally, we have Josephine Foreman Cole. She's closer to the 1929 spectrum. It started in 1909, and she's at the end of that spectrum in terms of when she entered UC Berkeley. She graduated with a degree in economics in 1929. Her efforts to become a teacher, though, were thwarted although she passed both her written and oral exams. The Board of Education said they couldn't place her in a school. So she then, finally, in 1943, it happened, and she became the first African-American teacher in San Francisco Unified School District. So she has her own oral history online that I found as well. It was just fascinating. She revealed that as a fellow San Franciscan, she knew Berlinda Davison and Vivian Osborne, and in 1992, the Southeast Library of San Francisco State University was named the Josephine Cole Library in her honor. And she also married the first Black motorman of Muni. So she was a true San Franciscan, and her family, her father was an incredible man as well. But I don't have time to go into that. So as I mentioned earlier in my talk, here are the two screenshots that I furiously took from my computer when I saw their faces on the Berkeley banner. Having had the privilege of recounting the stories of the lives of these remarkable women, I truly feel that I am a part of their legacy too. So I recently penned a letter of thanks to them, and I mean penned, just for the sake of my own desire to express my gratitude. In part, it reads as follows. Thank you all for your courage, your perseverance, and the gift of being able to share your life stories. Sometimes I imagine myself walking these paths with you, our voices mingled with the chimes of the campanile, our laughter, our thoughts, flowing as we quicken our steps, parting with the hope of meeting once again. Dear sisters of the blue and gold, welcome to your Renaissance. Thank you.
So I was wondering if you knew where they lived while they were going to college.
Good
because
question.
Berkeley, as you know, had restrictions on housing for not just African Americans, but Asians and other people from different backgrounds. And that's, of course, one of the stories the International House became. One of the rationales for International House was to provide housing where the city of Berkeley and other places would not, and also the co-ops that grew up out of the 30s. So there is a positive story on that side a bit. But where did they live?
Well, they relied heavily on the Black community. So, for example, Vivian Osborne's mother housed some of the Black students, and Ida Louise Jackson also, her family had a house in Berkeley. So they would sort of take turns, but that was the era of a lot of boarding rooms in Berkeley. So they were in boarding rooms and boarding houses, mostly, a lot of the men and women. But they would also sort of go into the network of the Black community and see who possibly had a room for them, because it was really difficult, like you said, for everybody, but extra difficult for them.
Great. Any other questions? Yes.
First, I wanted to say that I really enjoyed your walk around campus, or on the outside of campus, with the Black Staff and Faculty Organization. I hope you do more of those. And what was the building, I think, that you said was named after Ida?
The Ida Louise Jackson Graduate House, yes. So in 2004, there were some apartments called the College Durant Avenue apartments that were converted to the Ida Louise Jackson Graduate House, where, and what, I'm sorry, can you give me your name again? Donata is referencing is that I have created a Black history tour for campus, and I've had the ability and I'm just so thrilled to give it several times, and Donata was on the tour. So yeah, I hope you all come one day.
Thank you. Any other questions? I see a waving hand in the back. Is that right? Yes?
Yes,
Can you come up? please?
Oh, I'm sorry.
I don't. Sorry.
Thank you for your awesome presentation. Were there any particular experiences that you had or that you heard about that inspired you to look into the lives of these amazing women?
Yes, I'm so glad you brought that up. It was interesting because I am also a docent at Mount View Cemetery, which is incredibly beautiful and historic cemetery. Lots of people from Berkeley buried there, and Bancroft. We have so many people from Berkeley. But I would give the general tour, and then I co-led the Black History tour. And in co-leading that tour, I found out about Ida Louise Jackson, Walter Gordon, people that I thought, well, wait, why didn't I know about them? I've been on the campus for 34 years. I was a student. How is it that I'm learning about them at the cemetery in my role as a docent? So that really sparked my interest, and then I started, looking into, delving more deeply into the issue, because I thought, wow, this is odd. I don't hear about them, and I don't know about them on campus. So that sort of spurred me on to have this personal campaign, really, to find out more about them. And I love archives. Okay, I found out how much I love archival research. I would go into the cemetery records, which, needs some organization, but those old, beautiful books with the kind of cursive that you just wouldn't believe. You'd think it was the computer, just gorgeous. And really be able to look and find the records, everyone buried there. If I found a clue, I could go in the records and find it. So it was a great process. But that's really how I started getting interested in expanding my knowledge on the subject.
Any other questions?
I really like how you mentioned that these early students, there's no real Wikipedia pages for them.
Well, some of them do have them.
Right.
Yeah, good, because they are prominent and somebody took the time to actually give them a Wikipedia, but some, yes, you're absolutely right.
I'm curious if you have a favorite story of somebody you have read who doesn't have a Wikipedia page, and if you can share that.
Let's see, that doesn't. Well, my favorite is really who we talked about, and it's Vivian Logan Rogers. I mean, her father has a Wikipedia because he has quite an extensive history in this area. You can find him all over. He was very well respected as an engineer. But Vivian's story haunts me, I think, because she was on campus at a time when she did not have a cohort, right? At least Ida Louise and all of them had a group of women they could rely on and sort of and be in a conversation with. But Vivian Logan Rogers was on her own in 1909. And I qualify that a little bit. There is another woman named Grace White who was there around that time. Hard to find information on her. But I always think about her because it had to be pretty lonely. And she's a brown-skinned, beautiful girl. It had to be pretty lonely on this campus. So her story always intrigues me. I always wish I could find out more. And in fact, I'm planning a little trip to her neck of the woods to see if I can go find some more information on that family.
First, I want to express my own gratitude for our amazing speakers. I think that was a good choice of word right there. And I'm also really quite honored to be part of this event and willing to come. Knowing Carroll was a life-changing event for me, and she was such a loyal friend that I really spent the rest of my life expressing my gratitude for her, because she not only stimulated me intellectually and actually properly introduced me with Bill, are you still there? I guess not. Bill Roberts on how to use the Bancroft Library appropriately. And what do you know, he allowed me to go through the boxes. And I found several misfiled items, which allowed me to tell an amazing story because of that. But it was Carroll behind all of that. So I think it might be a good thing if perhaps, depending on how our panelists feel here, if you might want to say one more thing about either your presentation or Carroll, and then we can all go have something to drink. So, Sheldon, would I be?
Well, Anne, I want to just join those who thanked you for doing all this work and putting it together. And it's good to remember people who've done something. It's good to know that one has lived a life that has some meaning. Carroll did. And you said a great deal about her, and others have as well. So I just want to reiterate what I said. Her devotion to this campus was unparalleled, and therefore she threw herself into the wonderful work of documenting this campus, talking about it, talking about the University of California with enthusiasm, and bringing people together in the style that she had, character or not. She was somebody to really remember. I enjoyed all the presentations. I enjoyed very much. What I wanted to say, looking at the photographs of those lovely ladies, is how perfectly groomed they were. You notice? I walk around the campus these days, I don't necessarily see them. But it was just lovely to see just terrific self-dignity and pride. It's quite evident. So at any rate, it's lovely coming back, and thanks for letting me do it.
Thank you, Michelle. Catherine, you're right there, so would you mind saying, do you want to say something or not something? No?
Maybe the children did it.
Yeah.
They're always good.
Karen, before, do you agree that Sheldon said it all?
Well,
No.
I guess not.
well, and I certainly wanted to thank you. It was very enjoyable and to recall some extremely exciting days. I mean, this is history as a form of excitement and fun, and that's what we got from Carroll. And I was so glad somebody mentioned her trips to Venice, where I so envied the Brentanos for having their own apartment there. And that was another source of fun. So, and she was remarkable, and I'm so glad that you thought about giving her the kind of memory event that I think she would have very much appreciated.
And I think Karen deserves extra thanks because she postponed by one day her own trip to Italy and participate in this. So we're very grateful. Thank you so much. Has anyone else something they're wanting to say?
Carol objected to red clothes.
Red cars, too.
I think she objected to a few other articles of clothing. Or lack of.
They just screamed Stanford to her.
Right. Well, she was a true Cal Bear. Actually, in many respects, you could say. Well, thanks to you all for coming, and please enjoy the food and drink, which is there for your pleasure. And maybe we'll get in touch again as we see if we can organize a future for university history, because gee, I must certainly see an avenue for a lot of work. So thanks again. Bye-bye.